Large, formidable, and with jaws strong enough to crush through bone, Tyrannosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period were some of the most formidable animals you could have ever come across, especially if you were a small hapless dinosaur. But like any animal, they didn't start out this way. Tyrannosaurs and how they grew up is something of much intrigue, but also vigorous debate, much of which has made it a rather intimidating and challenging side of paleontology to get into. This is largely due to the scarcity of material, with the more frail remains of smaller animals being more difficult to preserve, with the selectivity of the fossilisation process generally favouring animals that have a good bit more heft on them, and can therefore remain more intact as their remains degrade. This then begs the question as to just what do we know? Well, when it comes to the very youngest stages, the embryonic and hatchling stages, it really isn't a whole lot at all. For a long time, what we knew of baby Tyrannosaurus was relegated to hypothetical reconstructions based on what we knew of the adult animals, and not actual skeletons that had been preserved and described, since their remains are practically absent from any formations. This has led to a lot of struggle when it comes to reconstructing baby Tyrannosaurs and what they may have been like, with the first known effort at predicting their anatomy coming from paleontologist Dale Russell's 1970 paper on the Tyrannosaurs of Canada. Russell aimed to go over the hypothetical proportions of a hatchling Gorgosaurus libratus, an animal that was once considered as a member of Albertosaurus back in the day, whereby he calculated the scaling trajectories of adult tyrannosaurs and then projected them to an individual with a 100mm or 10cm long femur. This prediction showed them to be both exceptionally long legs and small-bodied animals, very much different in appearance to their parents, with this hypothetical hatchling being estimated by Russell to be about 75cm long, so about the size of a small dog, and it's a reconstruction that even gets used today, given that for the longest time this was the most solid reconstruction that was out there. More reconstructions did eventually follow, namely in 2003 by Tyrannosaur researcher Phil Curry, who with far more data from additional specimens found over the years, was able to provide a more informed scaling regime, which in theory would lead to a better understanding of their proportions. As Russell did before him, he scaled to an individual with a 100mm long femur, which indeed led to a dog-sized animal, yet again. However, no illustrations accompanied Curry's reconstruction, and so, many years later, paleontologist and paleoartist Mark Whitten set out to reconstruct Curry's hypothetical hatchling tyrannosaur in 2022, and the results were truly crazy. This is what was ended up with. Now, if you're thinking this reconstruction is completely crazy, well, you're not wrong, since Curry himself recognised this reconstruction as unbelievable himself, and stating that, quote, "there are limitations to what can be done in extrapolating this data," end quote. While the overall animal isn't too different from Russell's reconstruction, in the body and head at least, the tibia is 60% longer and the metatarsals are 220% longer, which eventuates in a very stilt-like looking animal. These results on the surface could be thought of as errors in the scaling, but they actually fall within normal scaling equations, whereby the limitations that Curry referred to result of issues regarding the scaling of the proportions of extinct animals outside of observable ranges, which includes outlying scaling curves as well as low confidence intervals. It is all the stranger, since we do generally know a good bit about other small dinosaur proportions, though any extrapolation from limited data, like what we've had to work with regarding hatchling tyrannosaurs, is going to be shaky if we don't fully understand all of the factors involved. While this reconstruction, and the data it's based on, is obviously wrong looking, it is worth noting that there are many extrapolations that we're also familiar with that may well end up being wrong with further inspection. But because of their fragmentary nature, things remain uncertain until more data in terms of specimens come about and are properly described, which is just the nature of this kind of work. Ultimately, both reconstructions are likely not too far off in terms of general proportions, in that they both point to hatchling tyrannosaurs being long-legged and shallow-bodied little guys that very much shifted their proportions from their initial life stages, rather than looking like a carbon copy of their parents, how for example a good deal of lizards do. Of course, embryonic and/or hatchling material was unknown from the group when these studies were conducted, but that has now thankfully changed, as of 2021 at least. The first actual remains of baby tyrannosaurs, notably hatchlings, were described in a paper by Greg Funston and colleagues, where the embryos of an Albertosaurus, material consisting of a lower jaw and a tooth, and the embryo of a Daspletosaurus, consisting of a foot claw respectively, were examined, with them dating back to the Campanian through Maastrichtian stages of Western North America. The toe claw was found in 2017, and because of what was being learned on it, Funston and his team sought to reanalyse a jawbone that was also very likely from a hatchling tyrannosaur that was found in 1983. Of course, because of how small and frail this latter specimen is, the typical removal of the rock matrix around it would almost certainly break apart the specimen in the process. So because of this, more detailed study of the fossil couldn't be done. That was, of course, until new technologies came around. Funston and co. aimed to scan the fossil with a particle accelerator, and from there, were able to reconstruct the whole jawbone virtually, something which is a huge breakthrough for the science, since so many other fossils are just as frail, and would otherwise never be able to have their intricacies fully learned of. Using these high-powered X-rays to better examine the tiny remains, it was immediately noticeable just how much the bones resembled their adult counterparts, even at the very earliest stages of their lives. The tiny, 1-inch long jawbone that was found preserved even tinier teeth, which from their formation, it was evident that this was from an embryonic Tyrannosaur, the first ever to be found. It was able to be figured out that these teeth were indeed from an embryonic animal, since the teeth were exceptionally narrow, had poorly developed enamel, and all of them were also in varying stages of development. Also not to mention that the alveoli, the tooth sockets in the jaw, also completely lack teeth in them entirely, something which is not seen in hatched animals. On top of this, in one of the tooth sockets, a replacement tooth was in the process of being developed, but in quite a strange way. This is because usually, replacement teeth lie directly below the older tooth, whereby they then wear down the older tooth at the roots to be able to dislodge it. In the case of this animal though, said replacement tooth sits right beside the older tooth, and there is no evidence to be found of any root damage, something which has been observed recently in the first generation of teeth in reptile embryos. They also have another key Tyrannosaur characteristic, like a chin and a deep Mechelian groove down the side of the jaw, with the total jaw being estimated to be about the size of a mouse. In terms of overall size, the Albertosaurus embryodentary has been scaled to a body length of around 715mm, with the calculated to be larger Daspletosaurus specimen based off the toe claw being scaled in their full size to be over a metre long, which is huge for hatchling animals, in fact among the largest known of any animal that comes from an egg. These sizes are roughly comparable to what Russell had projected all the way back in the 70s, which is a neat validation of his prior work, and through the work Funston and his team have done, we now know better than ever where and how to find said fossils. The researchers also estimated the eggs they hatched out of were a giant 43cm long, making these also some of the largest ever too, which is fitting for such large animals. For additional information, the 2 Tyrannosaur remains that were examined were all found around the known remains of the nesting sites of other dinosaurs, meaning that Tyrannosaurs also nested in the same kinds of open areas as their prey, so this does help to narrow down the potential areas as to where more finds could potentially be made. By examining in more detail the development of the specimen's teeth and how their jaw changes over time, more could well be gleaned as to what specific changes Tyrannosaurs went through, with Funston and his team optimistic that we could eventually learn just how long these little tyrants spent in their eggs before eventually hatching out of them. Their teeth already showing similarities to their adult forms for bone crushing so early on in their development also has interesting implications for their early lives and ecology. So with all of this, while Funston's work is indeed an incredible sign that we are getting the basics of their size right, we still have a good way to go until we can sort out reliable body proportions for them, let alone their overall history within their eggs and how they functioned after hatching. Most of this would be assisted greatly by a complete specimen, but with how rare and improbable specimens like that are to fossilise, it's certainly not something to bank on by any means. Continuing on with their overall growth, T.rex, the biggest of the group, is already very big even amongst its own relatives, and to get to this point, they had to undergo quite some drastic shifts during their ontogeny as they grew up. To get to this point, and for them to survive past the hatchling stage, it is likely to an extent that T.rex and other tyrannosaurs exhibited some form of parental care, since many of their living relatives, crocodiles and avian dinosaurs, the birds, look after their young in their initial vulnerable stages to give them a good early start, with them then leaving them to fend for themselves as they get older. Pack hunting has been proposed with Albertosaurus at least, due to a bone beds preserving many juvenile and older adult animals together with no signs of prey remains in the same deposit, so they could well have had increased levels of sociality, but it is something that does require more research. Direct evidence of parental care from other non-avian dinosaurs, such as the Hadrosaurid Maiasaura and more closely related theropods like Oviraptorids, where both groups do show evidence of looking after their young during their earliest stages, so perhaps Tyrannosaurs too did something similar. Off topic, but still relevant to their potential appearance, is whether or not the baby Tyrannosaurs, and by extension the adults, had feathers, which is something that is just as debated upon as to their growth and relation to the soon-to-be mentioned relationship to Nanotyrannus. With my view from what I've gathered, is that, given from the understanding that pterosaur pycnofibers, the integument which is known to cover them is homologous with feathers, feathers and similar structures are at least ancestral to Ornithodira, the broader group which encompasses dinosaurs and pterosaurs, So it makes sense therefore that to an extent, bar potentially some more derived examples like in sauropods and ankylosaurs, all dinosaurs had at least some form of filaments here and there, and this would have especially been the case for tyrannosaurs given that basal relatives like Eutyrannus also possess them. Even if overall they are largely scaly, which is what most paleontologists today think, small filaments scattered across their body, though mainly on their dorsal region, could easily be a possibility, given how many living large animals that generally lack a lot of hair, e.g. elephants and whales, also still retain some small hairs, and in juveniles, them looking even more fluffy due to less of a surface area, making the sparse feathers more dense in their body, is not an unreasonable thing at all, especially that given their small size, it would be good for them to have some form of extra insulation. Filaments can also grow and coexist in the same region of the body as scales, as is the case with barn owls, whereby scale follicles can cover a developing filament. But of course, as the filament continues to develop, it eventually grows out of the scale it's been covered by, which shows that there's a lot of interesting cases to be noted as to how Tyrannosaur integument could be like. As these animals continue to grow, the juvenile forms of them were a good bit different than their bulky adult counterparts, with them in their younger years having proportions that match up more closely with that of the ostrich-looking dinosaurs, the ornithomimosaurs, where they were evidently more leggy and almost certainly much speedier animals. How they then grew up from animals that look like this into this, however, has not always been too fully understood. A paper published in 2020 by Tyrannosaur researcher Thomas Carr set out to examine just how T.rex growth rates took place and at what times, attempting to note how their extreme transformation over their lifetimes took place after examining 26 Tyrannosaur specimens to map out their growth, and what life stages they had and what differentiates them. To keep things as concise as possible, Carr found that there were 21 distinct growth stages with changes that were noted, along with 5 total growth categories, being juvenile, subadult, young adult, adult, and senescent respectively, stages which were all diagnosed through examinations of their histology, derived traits as they got older, and also their mass and overall size. To begin, the juvenile growth stage is defined as them having a rather shallow skull and jaws, with a total of 5 skull changes occurring during the stage, mainly affecting the skull roof and their mandible to become more elongate. While they may have been more gracile compared to adults, it doesn't mean that they were any less formidable of predators, as they do show some adaptations that even at their early ages, shows that they already had some traits that made T.rex and Tyrannosaurs as formidable as they were. For one, they have fused and higher placed nasals on their skulls, which from how they're oriented suggests that their positioning helped to brace their cranium against a shock from their bites, with the high strength of their teeth, even from juvenile T.rex, showing a higher capacity for a greater bite force and feeding force than even other Tyrannosaurs. While not quite yet having the same bulky heads of the adults just yet, they still had a higher capacity for bending and torsion when compared to other theropods, and still would have had bites that would have been even more powerful than other adult theropods that were in their size range. How this was found was through the examination of mechanical tests, which were designed to replicate the bites on finds that were attributed to come from juvenile T.rex. The first, interestingly enough, comes from bite marks on the nasal and maxilla of another juvenile T.rex, which is interpreted as being the case based on both the dimensions and spacing of the punctures, and the second is based on the feeding traces of a tail vertebra from an Edmontosaurus, where a juvenile rex seemed to have been pulling away at the flesh surrounding the tail, and took a little nibble out of the bone in the process. To see just how powerful these bites would have been, a tooth from the juvenile T.rex specimen BMR P2002.4.1 was digitised and replicated in a dental grade cobalt chromium alloy, and from there being mounted to an electromechanical testing system which helps to record the forces generated. Said tooth was then pressed into cow long bones in various locations to test for given stresses at varying speeds, with the forces required to cause punctures at these varying points being recorded and the dimensions measured to see how they all match up. What was found was that they had bite forces of up to 5,641 newtons, a figure that places them with a stronger bite force than polar bears, which clock in at around 5,000, which is a bite force that is higher than the previous estimated one for them, which was more around the range of 2,400 through 3,850, which means we know juvenile rexes could bite down with a force of up to 235% higher than what was previously reasoned. Of course, compared to the adults, these were paltry numbers, as they've typically been estimated as having bite forces of anywhere from 8,526 through to 34,522 newtons, though some estimates covering likely muscle fibre length come up with results where they're at an astounding 64,000 newtons of force, which is easily among the largest known of when it comes to any animal on record, living or extinct. Continuing on, The transition from this form to their subadult stage, which features a radical total of 53 changes that occur, happen even more widespread across their skull, with this stage representing the earliest onset of sexual maturity, as well as the most radical change in their overall anatomy. This occurred in just 2 years between 13 and 15 years of age in their middle age years, whereby their proportions during this period became radically more bulky, with their legs becoming proportionally smaller, as well as their skulls becoming much wider along their skull roof, where 47% of their proportional growth takes place, since their mandible elements mature a good bit earlier. This change marks the beginnings of the extreme bite forces present in adults, and is something that seems to most define the likely niche partitioning that took place between juvenile and adult rexes, which is something I'll explain more on later in the video. But for now, it seems more likely that the differences in niche were more so down to the increasing bite force as they aged, rather than more fundamental differences in their overall morphology, even though the juveniles were a good bit more agile than the adults. As is the case in living crocodiles, the transition of skull shape likely marks changes in their diets and of their preferred prey preferences, not to mention that overall size is also an important factor that separates adult animals from juveniles. With Nile crocodiles as an example, juvenile animals tend to frequent and remain in the rivers of which they're born near, until they then move into more lacustrine habitats, where they spend more time in and around lakes. With this in mind, potentially for T.rex juveniles, they may well have inhabited more closed forest environments that provided protection from the adults, and where they could feed on smaller prey, namely pachycephalosaurs and leptoceratopsids, etc., and as they grew, moved into more open habitats, where larger prey like Ankylosaurus, Edmontosaurus, and Triceratops were at. During their rapid growth stage from around ages 14 through to 18, they've been estimated to have gained, at the highest estimates, around 4.9 kilograms a day, the weight of an average cat, which is an astounding figure that really puts into perspective as to just how rapidly they grew. This is something that sets them apart from many other theropods, with them maturing at an extremely rapid pace, with them by their 15th through 18th year already exceeding the weight of most of their close relatives after they reach over 3 tons in weight. This weight gain makes them a big outlier in terms of how much mass is gained per year, though in terms of the timing, it is generally pretty in line with other tyrannosaurs, whereby they have their growth spurt sometime in their teens and then reach sexual maturity around their 20s. All of this growing means that if they were alive today and were in some sort of reserve or zoo, this would require a lot of feeding. Tying into that while we're on the subject, this is where the sponsor of this video comes in, being Jurassic World Evolution 3, where you can yourself feed a juvenile rex and follow their progress while tending to their needs. Releasing on October 21st on PS5, Xbox Series S and X, and PC, this third installment in the Park Builder series for the first time features juvenile dinosaurs, which are fittingly cute and have some great interactions with their older counterparts for you to enjoy. A non-linear campaign where you can explore a variety of global locations, new and old to the franchise, is also present, and you'll be guided by Dr. Ian Malcolm, of course voiced by the one and only Jeff Goldblum as well. Many customization features to edit the terrain of your given park are also available, meaning you can be as specific as you need to be when setting out your vision as to where your dinosaurs will live. Up to 82 distinct prehistoric animals from their juvenile through to adult stages are present, and as such, there's a lot of variety as to what your park's compositions can look like. As someone who has always been a fan of the films growing up and having an appreciation for them, being involved with the franchise and to also be able to do my part to help foster the next generation of dinosaur and prehistory enthusiasts is something I'm keen to be involved with and play a part in. If you're interested in pre-ordering and getting ahead of the curve when it comes to the game's release, be sure to click the link I've provided in the description of the video if you're keen. Continuing on, over half of the known T.rex specimens assessed in the study appear to have died within 6 years of reaching their sexual maturity, a pattern which is something also typically seen in other tyrannosaurs, as well as in many long-lived birds, where they are also characterised by high infant mortality rates, followed then by a period of relatively low mortality when they're juveniles. Their mortality rising again after they're sexually mature seems mostly to be down with the stresses involved with reproduction, such as an increased investment in preparing their bodies for it, as well as the compromisation of parts of their immune systems, not to mention the wear and tear on their bodies. This strategy of living fast and dying young has been suggested by researchers, including Thomas Holtz, to be down to them having a quick reproductive time and high clutch size, which is of stark comparison to most mammals, where they take longer to reproduce and generally have more parental involvement. This strategy does have its variations though amongst the wider groups of Theropoda, where in some other animals like Meraxes, the dinosaur, not the dragon, analysis of the holotype specimen revealed that they could have been anywhere from 39 to 53 years old when they died, having reached sexual maturity approximately 4 years prior to their death, between 35 to 49 years of age, something which makes them among the longest-lived non-avian dinosaurs currently known. The oldest known T.rex specimen by comparison, after going through all of the known specimens we have, is known to have been about 28 years of age when they died, which is quite the difference. It was determined in the study that described Meraxes that they extended their growth period through something known as hypermorphosis, rather than accelerating their relative growth rates like how T.rex did. An interesting tidbit is that juvenile T.rex fossils are very rare, and among other controversies that will be brought up later, are in many ways quite uncertain, potentially down in part to the low juvenile mortality rates I've talked about, meaning that there was less of a chance for them to be fossilised and therefore discovered by researchers. Getting back to their growth, they start to level off growth-wise at about age 20, with this likely indicating that this is when they reach their physical maturity, something which is supported by a specimen known as B-rex, which has some rather interesting preservation details that gives us some glimpses into their life history. Hypothesised to be around 18 years old at the time of their death, placing them right at the levelling off curve, this specimen from Montana preserves a femur bone that, when it was discovered, was hypothesised to contain medullary tissue within it. This tissue is only found within female birds during their window of ovulation, where in the central cavity of their bone shafts, the region of the bone where marrow is stored, an additional calcium supply is formed for eggshell production. Said tissue being found in B-rex therefore suggests that they were both of reproductive age in the process of forming eggshells, and were also female, though this data was inconclusive, and whether they actually had this tissue wasn't 100% known. This was until 2016, when it was finally confirmed in a paper by Mary Switzer, Lindsay Zano and colleagues, that the soft tissue within B-rex was indeed confirmed to be medullary tissue. This tissue also still preserved some of the original organic components that are typically thought to be completely lost during fossilization, let alone over tens of millions of years, with this find showing that fragments of tissues and molecules can persist over the course of great periods of geologic time. Type 1 collagen, the most common main organic component of bone, was also preserved in low concentrations, all of which was found through mass spectrometry, which is an analytical technique which measures the mass-to-charge ratio of ions, which has some big implications when it comes to the stability of organic molecules over time. Of course, DNA degrades over time, and even the oldest known DNA fragments, dating to 2 mammoth lineages more than 1 million years old, are incomplete and degraded, meaning that without a complete genome and also the technological means, there's no shot whatsoever of bringing back a T-rex, let alone any non-avian dinosaur in general. With us knowing that B-rex was decisively a female animal, it seemed to make evident something that had seemed to have been the case for a good while, that being that there were 2 distinct body types, or morphs, that were present in the population. These were the gracile and robust morphs, with the robust morph suggested to be the female, due to the pelvis and many of the robust specimens seeming to be wider, which could well have helped them in allowing the passage of eggs. It was also thought that the robust morphology of these rexes also correlated with a reduced chevron on their first tail vertebrae, which also better allows for the eggs to be passed out more easily, as had been reported on at the time for crocodiles. The issue with this hypothesis though was that in later studies, this idea had in many ways been refuted. A study done in 2005 showed that the claims of differing chevron anatomy in crocodiles that indicated sexual dimorphism was done in error and had been misjudged, meaning that T-rex having this feature among females of their own species had been based on an inaccurate understanding of a living relative, something that doesn't usually happen in paleontology. Sue, one of the most robust and also complete individual T-rex known for example, had a full-size chevron on their first tail vertebra, which indicates that robustness alone cannot be reliably used to differentiate the 2 morphs anyway. Since T-rex specimens also have a good deal of individual variation too, due to the sheer number of well-preserved specimens that have been recovered from them, among some of the highest of any dinosaur species, such differences attributed to sexual dimorphism could well come down to geographic variation, age, as well as of course individual variation, which I've mentioned. This is also not to mention that any potential lines of evidence for sexual dimorphism don't make themselves clear in the growth diagrams I've shown before in the video, with there not being a bifurcation that places males on one branch and females on the other. Of course in life, dimorphism could well have come through in other ways, potentially through differences in soft tissues, e.g. with their integuments, coloration, or when it comes to the ridges and bosses on their skulls. In the meantime though, until we can more reliably identify male and female rexes, or just of any non-avian dinosaur for that matter, just based off of their skeletal remains, these questions will remain largely unanswered. Finishing up this section on their growth, a study published in 2020 by Holly Woodward and colleagues, a paper I'll be talking about more in one of the next to be talked about segments, also found another notable thing about them, in that, during their growth, T-rex was able to slow down their growth to match environmental factors, such as when food was less available, and that their growth rate was also dependent to an extent on resource abundance, something which is useful when either their prey migrates or is otherwise just harder to find. With all this said, there is something I have yet to bring up, and that is the mid-sized theropod in the room that hangs over most discussions about T-rex growth, that of course being the discourse surrounding the controversial Nanotyrannus. This animal has been thought by some to be known from material currently assigned to be belonging to juvenile T-rex, and therefore filled in the mid-sized predator gap currently present in the Hell Creek Formation where T-rex is from. Debate has raged on, both among scientists, enthusiasts, and laymen alike since its initial description back in 1988 by Bakker, Williams and Curry, and is overall a very complicated and vigorous topic that I don't have the time to cover, at least in this video. I will talk about some of the topic here where it ties into T-rex growth, but if you do want to learn some more, be sure to check out Ben's recent video where he went into the history of the debate in great detail that I'd highly recommend. Getting into it, one big thing is the tooth count on remains that have been attributed to Nanotyrannus, whereby many of these smaller tyrannosaur specimens have higher alveoli counts than an adult T-rex, with individuals like the Cleveland skull and Jane having dentary tooth counts of 16 and 17 respectively. Adult T-rex like Sue meanwhile have counts of around 13 teeth, so this tooth loss has been presumed to be a trait that separates them from the larger adult T-rex. Such big changes in alveoli number don't seem to occur too commonly in other related animals, not to mention that there are other juvenile rex specimens that do have the same alveoli counts as the adults. The thing is, when it comes to all of this, is that the change in tooth counts could also well be down to individual variation, as there is already some level of fluctuation between the specimens we do have, with known adult animals displaying variation of between 11 and 15 tooth positions. This would mean that finding individuals with 16 or 17 teeth is not necessarily by itself a distinguishing trait, and it would only be with more specimens being acquired and studied that this could be more easily resolved. There are of course many undescribed specimens that could well be attributed to them, for example the hyoid remains in the Cleveland skull, the proposed Nanotyrannus holotype, where there could well be bone fusion both in this skeletal element as well as around their skull, which could well indicate that they were at or close to skeletal maturity before they died. This is of course newfound territory, so whether or not this shifts the discourse in any way is still yet to be determined or analysed in a more direct way, so we'll just have to wait on that. The 2020 paper by Holly Woodward and co. that I talked about earlier in relation to tyrannosaur growth also delved into the Nanotyrannus debates and how they fit into their environment as a whole. They examined bone samples obtained from the remains of known juvenile rexes and or Nanotyrannus, namely Jane and Petey, looking at chips from their tibia and femur, where they then polished them down until they were less than a millimetre thick, then putting them under a microscope for a closer look. What the team was examining was the small collagen fibres that made up their bone tissue, with them looking at how the bundles were organised, which is something that can help decipher just how quickly the bone has grown. For some background, the team noted that if the bundles are laid in an even way, it indicates that the growth of said bone was even and slow, and if they were disorganised, that is evident of more rapid growth that was punctuated more unevenly. This kind of information was something key the team wanted to look at, as it could have big implications for where Jane and Petey, both comparatively small animals, were at in their growth, as that would hopefully make it clear if these animals were close to being mature or not. After looking at them, they found that in both the Tyrannosaurs, their fibres looked like, in their words, pickup sticks, and that they were growing at quite a pace up until the point when they died. When they looked at their growth rings, they found from them that Jane died at around 13 years old, while Petey had died at about 15. Both ages which are right around the time that T-rex is projected to have begun their rapid expansion in their growth. Some of their rings were very close together in their earlier years, which is something that makes clear more minimal growth was taking place, though some of their other rings were much further apart, indicating that at some point, the opposite, rapid change, was instead taking place. This led the researchers to conclude that all of this shows that these specimens being Nanotyrannus, and therefore distinct from T-rex, was less likely a possibility than them just being juveniles on the cusp of their rapid growth phase, though of course this is far from the last we'll be hearing on the subject. At some point, when more of the research being done into Nanotyrannus' validity is eventually published, I will aim to come back to this topic and to discuss what any new papers do end up showing. It's overall a rather murky time scientifically speaking, whichever way you look at it, but for now, saying that the supposed nanospecimens we have are juvenile rexes is generally, and I do say generally, the safer bet as of now at least. Either way, these tyrannosaurs of these sizes were still especially formidable in their own right, with them likely well having their own niche in their environments that made them both a good deal different from how the adults operated, as well as likely leading to something truly interesting. That being that they've reshaped their communities by outcompeting many other predators of a similar size that would otherwise be plentiful alongside them. Two key papers, both published in 2021, the first being led by Kat Schroeder and the second by Thomas Holtz, both found that in comparison to many other Mesozoic assemblages, there was quite a big gap in the fossil record of assemblages where large tyrannosaurs like T.rex were present, which is something both studies attribute to the juvenile forms of adult tyrannosaurs instead taking their place, essentially taking up the role of multiple species as they grew, rather than other differing species being present. The first study by Schroeder aimed to examine data from fossil localities across the planet, going over 550 dinosaur species. After organising all of them, they then went over the number of small, medium, and large dinosaurs that were present, and did manage to find some patterns. The main one was that very few dinosaurs between the sizes of 100 kg through to 1 ton exist in communities when there are megatheropods, namely Tyrannosaurids and Abelisaurids, where it appears that the juvenile forms instead take their place due to them having quite different adaptations when compared to the adults. This is in sharp contrast to Jurassic Age communities, where there were smaller gaps present that seems to be down to the observation that Jurassic megatheropods, for example animals like Allosaurus, had juvenile stages that are more like the adults niche-wise, which helps leave more room in assemblages to have more of a diversity of both predator diversity and of different sizes too. Tyrannosaurs already are known to have an increased level of agility compared to other large theropods, around double in fact, even compared to animals half their size, which is known from this fabulous paper by Snively and co. And this was especially the case with juvenile tyrannosaurs, where the juveniles had agility index values of up to 2 or even 3 times greater agility than Allosauroid individuals of a similar mass, which gave them a good advantage in their environments of being highly mobile and active predators. The factor that could well have played a big part into why all these assemblages were so different was with the presence of sauropods. This could well be down to sauropod communities having more diverse size ranges and extremes than what was the case in areas where T.rex lived, where animals like Triceratops and Admonosaurus were present, since while they were still huge, oftentimes bigger than an average elephant, they didn't reach the peaks that sauropods reached, and that therefore led to more diverse niches being taken up. These animals were much rarer and or non-existent in a lot of these communities by the end of the Cretaceous, and because of this lack of a range and size, it meant that therefore there was less of an evolutionary incentive for there to be more diversity in the predators, therefore that would prey on them. This is where Thomas Holtz's paper comes in, whereby he verified previously anecdotal observations of there being a drop-off in the diversity of medium-sized theropods in the assemblages that had tyrannosaurs as the main apex predators. This was all while the diversity of prey species hadn't declined to the same degree. So Holtz hypothesized, with evidence to back him, that since prey species had maintained the diversity, even with the lack of a large predator size range, there wasn't necessarily a decline overall in dinosaur populations because of negative environmental conditions, but more so that juvenile tyrannosaurs had stepped up to fill in the mid-sized predator niche, which from there precluded other theropods from being able to also be around alongside them due to the competition that these gracile individuals would pose. All of this is fascinating research, and there's certainly a lot more that can be learned about them and their growth yet to be understood. There's a lot in this video too that I'll be aiming to expand upon in the future regarding the rather awesome adaptations that Tyrannosaurs had that allowed them to become some of the land's most formidable carnivores, so I hope to get some of that out when I've got some time. With that, I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. It was a very fun time researching for it, and I did learn a lot of neat things along the way about these animals thanks to all the incredible work done by the researchers I've mentioned throughout. You can read more on their papers in the description below in the sources section, as is always the case for research videos like this. And you can also, once again, check out Jurassic World Evolution 3, where you can check out the pre-order link and other details down below. Once again, I'm very happy to have been sponsored by people involved with a franchise that has such an importance in the place of paleontology, regarding people getting interested in the field, and them eventually going on to become researchers and field workers. So I'm quite proud to have partnered with their team over the course of working on this video. With that, I thank you for watching this video on these animals, and that you may have learned something new. If you would like to see more from this channel, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And with that, I'll see you next time, whenever that may be.